All right, let's roll. Welcome to Decatur Makers Ham Radio Lunch and Learn. My name is Jim. My call sign is N4BFR. And I'm going to talk to you today about getting started in ham radio and how amateur radio kind of gets into your hobby stuff and letting you know how you can get involved, what it takes, what the steps are, what the different things mean as we go forward. So it's a basic primer on getting started in ham radio. In addition, I'm taking your questions as well via the YouTube live chat. So come on in the chat and let me know if you've got any questions. And I'll be keeping an eye on that as we get started. And hopefully I've left a lot of time for questions at the end. Should take about, let's call it half an hour or so, just to run through some slides I put together so you guys can all understand that. And I will make the slides available later on, as well as plenty of time for questions and discussion as we go forward. So thanks for everybody for joining today, and we're going to rock on with the presentation. So I thought it might be helpful to tell you a little bit about who I am and why I'm giving a ham radio presentation. So my name is Jim, and as I said, my call sign's N4BFR. I have been a ham for 12 years. I got started in ham radio because I started listening to shortwave radio. I'd be searching around on the internet to see, gee, is there, other shortwave stations I can see? And I kept coming up with, find out about ham radio, find out about ham radio. So I took a practice test online, passed it the first go, and said, all right, let's go. And that's how I got started. So a couple of the pictures here, the one on the left is me over Christmas time activating a park. There's a ham radio group called Parks on the Air, and I was doing a park down in South Georgia. The middle left picture is me in Connecticut. The W1AW station is the station that's put together by the American Radio Relay League, the ARRL, which is the national club. Think of it as the NRA for ham radio. Next to that is one of my early days in ham radio. This was an event we call Field Day, where everybody tries to go out and activate out in a park or as a group for a day. And so I was out there at Field Day trying to do some digital contacts. And then over on the right, this is one of the pictures from me helping out in emergency communications at one of the events here in Metro Atlanta. I believe that was, I don't know, judging by the fact there are no leaves on the trees, it was probably something like the Publix Marathon as opposed to the Peachtree Road Race. But anyway, that's me helping out in the park. So lots of different things in ham radio you can do, and 12 years, and I don't think I've done them all, and there's a lot of different things to get started on. We'll tell you about that as we go along. So, as an overview of kind of the things I'm going to cover here today, I'll give you a background on what ham radio is and how it's defined by the FCC. I'll tell you what I consider to be the three elements of ham radio, the three different areas that people generally focus on, although ham radio, you'll find out, is a hobby that's a mile wide and an inch deep in some cases, or you can go an inch wide and a mile deep. There's lots of different things you can find out about ham radio. I'll tell you just quickly what it isn't to try and dispel a couple of the myths there. How to get licensed, maybe some things because you're not able to do some things now, what you can do to get ready to take a ham radio test, and then I'll talk about what's next and just general things coming up that you may be interested in. So let me rock on through this and just remind everybody one more time before I get going. We're using the live chat on YouTube to take questions, so feel free to fire those into the chat room there. It's about 20 seconds delayed, but I will do the best I can to keep up with them as we go. Moving right along. I thought the best way to kind of go through this was to start at how the FCC defines ham radio. Now, why did I do this? Well, because ham radio is a licensed service. So when you become a ham radio operator, you get licensed by the FCC. So here is what the ham radio operators as we know what are licensed for. So amateur and amateur satellite services. So this is the ability not only to talk on the radio and use things like a handheld, but actually be able to talk and operate through satellites through the International Space Station. They are available to qualified persons, people who've passed the test. No age restrictions as long as you're interested in radio technique, and this pecuniary interest here means you can't do it for pay, right? So we don't transmit messages for money. We don't work as dispatchers and take funds for that. We are strictly doing this on a volunteer basis. The opportunities here: self-training, intercommunications, technical investigations. I call those something a little bit different, but I'll show you that in a second. Lots of frequency bands available to hams, and I'll show you that here in a second as well. There's also digital, analog, pulse spread spectrum, so different types of modulation for doing different kinds of things. So, as I mentioned a minute ago, mile wide, inch deep. So what do I mean by bands? I think that's a pretty good question here. I'm going to pop myself up in here so you can see me while I talk. A band is basically a group of frequencies that are used for different methodologies and that travel different through space. And when I say space, I mean the air in general as opposed to space specifically, although that is part of it as well. So if we start down at the bottom, you'll see there's maritime radio navigation. This is things like LORAN, like talking to the Coast Guard. So if you ever watched an episode of the fishing boat show from The Deadliest Catch, there was an episode where, and they frequently use the radios, and they typically use these very low frequency or low frequency radios. But there's an episode where they're using this very low frequency spectrum to talk to the Coast Guard to call for help. Those are the kind of frequencies that they use there. The things about these VLF and LF and even middle wave and HF to a certain extent, they travel distances by bouncing off the atmosphere at various intensities at various times of day. So one of the things you learn in ham radio is what works at 12 noon may not work at 8 o'clock in the evening to try and talk to somebody over HF. And that's some of the things that are used in those stations. If you've ever listened to an AM radio station and you're in Atlanta and that station is in Cincinnati or New Orleans or whatever, you've experienced this kind of, we call it propagation, this kind of way that the signals travel by bouncing off the atmosphere. When you switch from 10 meters, 30 megahertz on up, and you'll see the green arrow there, that is the VHF and above frequency. And when you first get licensed, your usage is really restricted to that 10 meters and above frequency range. Now, there's still a lot of things you can do. You can talk on a handheld. You can do ham radio over Wi-Fi. You can communicate with satellites. All these kind of things are done in ham radio. But in order to do a lot of the VLF to HF work, you do need additional licensing. And I'll talk a little bit about the licensing piece in a minute. So in ham radio, I mentioned a couple of minutes ago the FCC definition, which showed 3 different areas of work. I like to think of it this way. There's the public service and emergency communications of it. That's kind of a column into what people do. There's international communications, and that's going to include things like radio sport. It's going to include something you may have heard called DXing. It's going to include emergency communications to a lesser extent. And then there's the science of radio as well. This is what can we do new or different? How can we experiment? So amateur radio satellites came around in the 60s. More recently, there have been physicists who are developing new ways of sending signals. All of that experimentation is made possible through ham radio. diving into the public communication service side, we kind of call this the when all else fails section of ham radio. This is if you think back to when ham radio was first really getting going during after World War I and before World War II, there was a need for radio operators to learn and be able to communicate as a backup for people who have gone off to war or other things. So if the power goes out, if the cell phones go out, this is where ham radio gets called in when all else fails. So I heard a great example of this would be a few years ago, there was some activity in D.C. and their cell phone service went down. Ham radio was able to come in and do that. I've heard stories where ham radio folks have come in and just set up at busy intersections around town because the phones were out, so people had an opportunity to call for help, and the ham could relay that back to the police station or the local emergency service group. So this is the kind of things that hams are doing when they're participating in this group. Now, I should say, just because you're licensed for this, this is not a drafted kind of thing. It's just an area where people who are interested in this type of thing could participate. I mentioned things like supporting marathons. A couple of big items that the ham radio folks here in Metro Atlanta do for public service communications includes not only the Peachtree Road Race, it includes the Publix Marathon. We helped out on the Olympic Marathon this year, and all of that goes to making sure people are aware of start times, making sure that people are getting picked up if they need help, if there's enough, relaying communications, if there's enough water at the water stops. All those kind of things are important and needed. They give us the opportunity to practice in case of emergency, and they help out the community as well. So that's one of the things that we do. I mentioned international communications as well, so let's look back at Puerto Rico a few years ago. Communication was out due to a hurricane. Over 30 hams from Georgia were sent there to help local communities communicate, deliver their needs back to the main area where they could get additional help. We also do severe storm spotting, kind of falls under this as well. So not quite the group from Twister that you've seen in the movies, but these are folks who will be able to connect up with the National Weather Service, and we actually have radios in partnership at the National Weather Service building down in Peachtree City, so we can communicate specific problem areas as they're coming up. And again, power may be out. Because of the rain, other communications methods may be out, but with ham radio, we can bring that data directly into the National Weather Service, and they can act on it quickly, issue reports, or anything else they need to do to manipulate that data. And lots of times what they will do is they will actually come to us and say, hey, we're looking for somebody near Dahlonega. We think there's a storm. Or we're looking for someone in Paulding County because we think there's a storm. Can somebody check on this? And so it's a very good partnership between us and the National Weather Service. So these are the public service communications things we use. Generally, you're talking about working via a handheld or a mobile radio. So I got one of my handhelds here. This is a repurposed Motorola business radio. I'll show this one here real quick. This is a Kenwood, kind of typical what you might see a ham carry. It's got dual band. It has its own battery. Probably lasts about 7 or 8 hours on a charge. And I can use this to bounce it against any of the local repeaters I can see. Bounce a signal off Stone Mountain or the Bank of America building, and we can talk to other people around in the area. So that's the kind of thing we're using to talk. We not only use FM communications, analog communications in this area, but there's been, especially over the last 10 years for D-Star and 3 or 4 years for digital mobile radio, there's been an expansion of digital communications. And how these work is really these digital communications allow us now to communicate statewide with those same kind of disaster networks. Right now, there is a 3 times a week network and communications group that gets together at 7 o'clock in the evening, and we do a statewide check-in, and it's just a health and welfare check-in, but it's good practice in case something does happen with the coronavirus that might impact communications in some way. So D-Star across the state, that's just us bouncing a signal into a repeater being either internet connected or connected kind of daisy chain to another repeater to be able to communicate, and it just sends the signal digitally as opposed to via analog. We use high frequency for long distance communications, and I'll kind of get into that in the next section because that kind of covers the international piece a little bit more. And in case you're interested, who do I know who's into ham radio? If you have ever watched the TV show Last Man Standing, you'll see that Tim Allen actually has Tim Allen's character has a ham radio in his house and in his office. He also operates and has his ham license. He's KK6OTD. So good for Tim, and we appreciate him supporting the hobby as well. Let's transition to the second part of ham radio's mission, as I like to think of it, which is international communications. International Fellowship. The Atlanta Radio Club used to have on their badges, and it changed over the last couple of years, but it used to be Amateur Radio for International Fellowship. And the whole idea here is really just, I can get on the radio, I'm going to put an antenna that's 80 feet long in my backyard. I'm going to use these signals bouncing off the sky in various ways and forms to talk to different people around the world instead of around the country. So a different method of communications, but it still is voice or digital communications that way. And this is the area where you also see Morse code. So if you think about hams as Morse code operators, that is still the case, although it's not required. A lot of people have adopted Morse code as their preferred way of communicating. I see a question from Tia on the chat here. If cell phone service or power outages are not an issue, why is it preferable to use ham operations for events like marathons? I think one of the reasons is not tying up the cell phone network. The other reason is also being able to have a focused area of communication. So if I've got a ham at each water stop, I know I can reach the water stops easily, and I can reach them all at a single point in time instead of having to call 5 different cell phone numbers or whatever. So we're generally, when we operate in a thing like a marathon, we're centralized with a station at either Atlanta Police Department or Fulton County Emergency Operations Center, and we're in the same place as the cops and the firemen and the ambulance folks, so we can all more quickly communicate that way. So it's speed of communications as much as anything else, and again, it's also redundancy. So if for some reason cell phones would go down, we're still there and still have that opportunity to communicate. So Tia, I hope I answered your question there. So international communications on the HF side, really when all else fails. I talked about that a little bit a couple of minutes ago. Health and welfare. If you're really interested in this area of ham radio, a good place to start looking might be the Salvation Army group called Saturn, Satern. And Saturn regularly operates their ham radio services in areas that have been impacted by major events and disasters, those types of things. So think about the Puerto Rico situation again that I mentioned. Though the Salvation Army may set up their own ham radio network just to communicate with their people in and out of their volunteer groups. So that's an interesting way to do it. We also support other groups via ham radio. There's a group called MARS, the Military Area Auxiliary Radio System. It's over 90 years old. Doesn't get as much use as it used to, but it's still out there and still available. So again, if communications are interrupted between here and Iraq and somebody needs to get a message to their family, those kind of things, that group is available and ready to help transmit messages and carry information along as they go. So another thing we support. And then there's the international fellowship side. This is the fun part of HF. So we have three different things that kind of fall under radio sport. One of them is contesting, which is really just all about, I've got my radio, I'm sitting here in Chamblee, Georgia at the moment, and I want to see how many people I can talk to in Europe in a weekend. So for 48 hours, a lot of stations from Europe are going to get online, and I'm going to try and call them and work them at various times in various stations. And at the end of the day, a group will get all the results together and say, "Hey, Jim was third best in Georgia at talking to Europe during this contest or that." So it's a way to have fun, make some contacts. There's interesting things that go on in that contesting area. For instance, there is one of the big tech guys, and his name escapes me at the moment. Maybe somebody can throw it in the chat room. The tech this tech guru has bought a big compound on an island in the Caribbean, and he will go there for all these big major contests we have. And there's probably one or two big contests a month. But he'll go down there and he'll get his buddies together, and they'll all text for the weekend and play radio, and then head on back to Silicon Valley. So it's an interesting way that participates. Excuse me one sec. The other thing that we do is something called DXing, and really that's about state counting, county counting, international counting. So DX is ham radio short code for distance, and how many distance people, distant places can I talk to. There is an award called the DXCC for Distant Century Club, and if you can talk to 100 different places outside of the U.S. or outside of the country you live in, you qualify for this DXCC award, and I'm happy to have won that. And right now I'm at about 125 different countries that I've talked to. The number you can get, because there are old countries and partial countries. In this case, Alaska and Hawaii count as separate countries from the continental U.S. You can get actually over 330 countries, so I'm about a third of the way there, but I've gotten all the easy ones, and the hard ones are going to have to be watching for them and kind of watching for people to pop up on there. So lots of different people talking internationally. It's going on over your head all the time. You just may not realize it's happening, but it's definitely an area of ham radio where you can get lost in for a good long time. So we use high frequency radio for that. This is the radios that you may think of more as kind of shortwave or military style radios. They got the big dial on the front, and you wheel it around and you're listening through the static for different communications. We do sideband, which is shortwave, kind of an offshoot of AM that is used, and it's an analog term. There are some people that do digital, either by sending their digitally encoded voice, or they send digitally encoded messages. There's probably 100 different ways you can do that. The current favorite one for people is something called FT8, and FT8 was actually put together by a physicist, and he defined this because he's into this low noise communications, because he actually tries to hear pulsars and those kind of things. So he's taken his everyday work that he does as a scientist and turned it into something for amateur radio, which is really cool. I think I've got his name on the next slide. There's also Morse code, dit-da, dit-da-da. It is not required, but I think there's a lot of people who have come into ham radio and said, wow, this is cool. There's a big subculture that just do Morse code. Or I want to do international communications, but I want to specialize in low power. Well, Morse code really can get the signal the furthest with the least amount of power, so they're going to take Morse code to do that. And that's the kind of thing that you may have heard of this guy, Joe Walsh in the Eagles. He's played by himself some too. But he is an avid Morse code operator, so you could actually get on the air one day and hear KU4UB operating, and be able to work him in a contest or just have a contact with him. So that's the international communication side of ham radio. I see a question from Mr. White. He wants to know if the Red Cross has a relationship with amateur radio. We absolutely do. We support amateur radio in a couple of different ways, and support the Red Cross in a couple of different ways. Very, very parallel plans. It's different experiences in different areas depending on the level of integration, but certainly at a national level, the American Radio Relay League, the ARRL, and the American Red Cross all support each other for that kind of distance communications as well as emergency communications and public service communications I just talked about a couple of minutes ago. All right, third element in ham radio, I call it the science of radio. This is how do we make new things, different things? How do we use ham radio for whatever we want? And the real interesting thing about this is in every other part of the area that the FCC regulates, you have to have your equipment approved before you use it. So Motorola can't sell a radio without going through FCC testing. The folks at Uniden can't make a radio without going through some sort of FCC testing. This is different for ham radio. Ham radio gets to experiment. So if you want to go and get all the parts together from DigiKey and build a breadboard and put it in an Altoids box and start making communications through Morse code on that, you absolutely can do that. It requires no certification needed. Design your own circuit, design your own methodology, and start talking. So experimenting and making, this is where the maker and indicator makers and the ham radio piece really kind of fits in well together. I mentioned the physicist earlier. It's Joe Taylor, K1JT, who's doing these low noise methods of modulation. There's also a couple others that he's done. One of them is called Whisper, Weak Signal Propagation. So the idea being you can more effectively hear low power signals by using his types of modulation. So ways that you transmit the signal. So it's really a fascinating area. I haven't spent as much time in that area as I could, but it's definitely an interesting one, and I think it speaks to other kinds of things. So when I think about the science of radio, there's another story I like, which is when they designed one of the recent versions of the Corvette, they didn't really have a place on the car where they could put all the antennas that they felt like needed, because they want an FM antenna, they want a satellite receiver, and then they didn't want to mess up the design of the car. Well, at GM, they found a couple of hams and said, hey, you guys are into this radio thing, you guys are into this antenna thing. The hams came through and helped GM design how the antennas were put into the Corvette. So another interesting way of kind of the way some of these ham radio elements bridge over into other things. Talked a little bit about amateur satellite. There are, I think, about 10 or 15 amateur satellites up at the moment. The number varies from time to time, but they're these little CubeSats. They're really kind of a 18 inches by 18 inches kind of little boxes. Well, you see one there. That's one of the first CubeSats in the picture, but they're smaller now, and you get a directional antenna and you just bounce your signal off of it and back down. I think one of the really cool things is the International Space Station has a couple of ham radio things. First of all, they have just a radio that the astronauts can use either to talk themselves to other people, or it's more typically used for having conversations with school kids. And one of those just happened a few weeks ago up in North Fulton County, where kids got to spend 10 minutes and talk one-on-one with a satellite, one-on-one with an astronaut on that satellite in space. So it's really kind of cool that is used. They also have a couple of different repeaters, which is something that pulls in a signal and bounces it back on another frequency. One of those is called APRS. That's a way for people to communicate positions with position packet data, and people bounce information off of that as well. So last night, I think I just heard last night was a really good night for satellite passes. So I think there were a few folks out there trying to bounce some signals off the ISS last night. The other thing that I think is really cool, and I know that there are some folks who are interested in this, is high Earth orbit balloons. Rocketry, so if you're going to send a rocket up, you got to be able to find it. You want to know where it is. You want to know how fast it's going. Rocket telemetry is something that you can do via ham radio. Folks who are using drones and things like the old school airplanes and helicopters, radio controlled things that we had before they were drones, also use ham radio telemetry. And there's a whole group of folks who are interested in high Earth orbit balloons. So you get some Mylar, you put some helium in it, you make a little package that attaches to it, you send it up, and I think I've heard one of those balloons has gone around the world for more than a year in high Earth orbit just because it keeps going, it charges via solar, and it just keeps sending out its data. So again, you can go a mile wide, an inch deep, or you can be like this group where it just says, I'm going to do high Earth orbit, and that's how they spend all their time on ham radio. And if you were interested in the astronaut side, Owen Garriott, who was licensed as W5LFL, he was the first radio amateur to operate in space. He was on shuttle mission STS-19 in 1983. And if you really want to see his radio, if you go down to Kennedy Space Center in the Atlantis exhibit, off in a corner, you can actually see the radio he used to communicate from space via ham radio on. So, thanks to Mr. Garriott. And his son is still an astronaut, still a ham as well, and they're keeping up the tradition going there. So, all of those are the things that ham radio does. Here's what we don't do. And I always think of these kind of things when I think back to about 8 or 9 years ago, I got to meet Governor Deal, and we walked in. There were 7 or 8 of us in the room, and we walked in to meet Governor Deal, the governor of Georgia, because he was going to sign a proclamation for Amateur Radio Week. And he was like, "Hey, I just watched Smokey and the Bandit last week. That's you guys, right?" And I'm like, we're all kind of cringed, and we go kinda, because it is talking over wirelessly, but it's not really CB. So CB, special set of frequencies, licensed, channelized, and it used to be licensed, now no longer licensed, very low power, and really just kind of a different methodology and a different use case, right? This is for truckers and other people to communicate along as they're driving and those kind of things. So that's what CB has evolved to versus amateur radio. There's been a movie and a TV show called Frequency where somebody uses a ham radio to talk to their dad, who was a ham radio operator way back in the day. I've never time traveled via amateur radio. The closest I've come is I was operating one day and I was trying to make a contact, and I actually heard myself like a second later after I said my call sign, because my signal had literally traveled around the world and come back to me. That's very rare, but that's also just a second in time, not years later after Dad has passed on. So we don't talk to ghosts. We also don't play music, so no Good Morning Vietnam, no, get the rock and roll out and keep the troops entertained. That's not what we're licensed for. There is only one reason that you can play music over amateur radio, and that is specifically to do something with the ISS and the astronauts on the space station. That's the only exception to it. Outside of that, no music allowed on ham radio. So now that you know that it's not, and you know what it is, let me talk about getting licensed. Like I said, ham radio is a licensed group. There are 3 current levels of licenses. There are a couple others that have been depreciated over time. There are 3 current levels of licenses that you can achieve. The first one is the entry level one. It's called the technician exam. This is, as I mentioned earlier, primarily focused on the local communication. So you're going to use a radio in your car to communicate to a repeater in town, or across town to somebody on top of Stone Mountain, or you're going to use a handheld to work in the parade. This is the kind of level that the technician starts in. Most people who sign up for ham radio stop there. That fulfills what they need, and about half of all licensed hams in the U.S. today are at the technician level. They love to do that. It's a license to learn. You can do all the things that we talked about with satellite or with telemetry for rockets and those kind of things, and it's a perfect place for them to stop. The next level up, though, is called the general license. And the general license adds a lot of the availability of the HF band. So you can pretty much make a communication on any band at any time of day that ham radio is licensed for. When you take the test, it does require a deeper electronics knowledge, so you need to know more about simple circuits and how to build them and what they do, a little more focus on safety as well. You're going to be communicating more internationally, so think of it as making sure that you've got the safety elements built up and the knowledge to be able to actually build that circuit and communicate internationally. The final, the top line here is Amateur Extra. This is the gets you the rest of the frequencies, and really the difference here is like on a band like we'll pick a band 40 meter 7 megahertz. There is a section that is just exclusively for Amateur Extra to give them the opportunity to kind of have a exclusive. You achieve the top area, so you get a little bit of the frequency that others can't use. Now, general can use most of it, but just this little part of Amateur Extra is saved for folks who have that extra privilege. Other things that you can do with extra, it makes it a lot easier to operate from foreign countries. You can do some of that as a technician in general level too, but if you want to, say, operate from a cruise ship or fly to Cayman Islands to operate for a day, it's a lot easier to do that via having the Amateur Extra, because that's kind of on par with how all the other countries license, and they do a lot of reciprocal licensing there. And if you study for the test, you'll find out more about that in the ham radio testing information. The other thing an Amateur Extra can do, and again, generals can do this too, but not to the same extent, is an Amateur Extra can administer a license exam. So right now, all license exams are done in person, with a very small exception for Alaska, and they are done by volunteer examiners. So these are Amateur Extra licensees who come in, and it takes 3 people to sit and watch you fill out the little dots on the paper, and then we grade it and tell you pass. So all that is done by hams for hams, but it's really best if you're an Amateur Extra to do that. When you go to test to be an Amateur Extra, you're really going to be focused on electronics theory. And this was the hardest part for me. I was fine with technician in general. I struggled with the extra, but I made it through. And I think the best part about that is I never have to take that test again as long as I keep my license active. So licenses last for 10 years, but as long as you renew them, you maintain it. So you maintain the level that you're at. If for some reason you let your license lapse, you can get back to the level you were at by retaking the technician exam, and there's all different timepieces there as well. But it is a time-based thing there. Licensed for 10 years, so I'm on my second 10 years now. I've been licensed since 2008 and still having a good time. And no code required. No Morse code required in any of the licenses. So about 15 years ago, they decided that the powers that be decided they wanted more licensed hams. They didn't feel like Morse code was a good barrier to entry. You'll still hear some hams say, "Oh, I should bring the Morse code back. They're not really hams if they don't have Morse code." It is what it is, and there's a lot of people doing it without code. So you can decide as you go along. So what does it take to get licensed? You're going to take an in-person test. They are looking into, can we do remotely conducted tests? that is not in place yet. Well, like I said, with a very small exception of Alaska because it's so remote, but they're looking to see if that model will work. The in-person test, generally every weekend around Metro Atlanta, there's a test somewhere. So I know the second Sunday of the month there is a test at Decatur Peachtree Airport. The Alfred Memorial Radio Club has a regular test as well in the Stone Mountain area. There is a group at Georgia Tech that has a test on the fourth Sunday. North Fulton has a test. So you get the idea here. You can quickly go on and say, I'm ready to test this weekend. You can probably find a place to do it once the big COVID issue is over with and we can start to gather in person again. Cost is up to $15. Some places are free. Some places are not. Just check. It's never going to be more than $15. That $15 covers taking the test and getting your license. So it's never going to be more than that to get going. And license renewals are free as well. To be a technician, you have to take a test that includes 35 multiple choice questions. The pool of questions is 432, and they are laid out in 10 areas. So you will always have a question on your test from each of those 10 areas as part of that 35 question test. If you get, somebody's going to correct me, I think it is, you can miss 12 and still pass at this level. So if you can get 28 out of 35, you pass, you're a ham, as long as you keep your license renewed. So the testing and the question areas here vary from safety to how things work to some basic circuit design. I like to say if you know the difference between a resistor and a capacitor, you're probably halfway there in passing your test. But let me show you two questions that are actually on the test. All the questions on all three exams are open source, so you can go and see all the questions, you can see the answers, and study them in advance. Now, they're not always presented with the answers in the same order. They're not always presented in the same order on the test, but you can be sure if you go in to take a test that it will be 35 of those 432 questions, and then those pools are cycled every 3 years as well. So if you were going to go and take I think it's the amateur extra exam, that pool of questions that's used now will expire at the end of June. You'll have fresh questions, a fresh pool of questions to use after that. So on the technician exam, here are a sample of two of the questions. I'm just going to let you do this on your own and think about that for a second. But the question is, what is the meaning of the term broadcasting in the FCC rules for the amateur radio service? And here are the four answers that are on the test that you have to choose from. Is broadcasting two-way transmissions by amateur stations? Probably not. Is it transmission of music? Well, it could be, but not necessarily. Is it transmission of messages directed only to amateur operators? Well, no, because that's kind of what you're doing in ham radio, right? So it's really D, transmissions intended for reception by the general public. There are, TV stations and radio stations, they are called broadcasters, and that's their job. We are not broadcasters. We are strictly doing things for the enjoyment and communications between ham radio operators. So D would be the correct answer here. What is a transceiver? So let's see. We've got the four options. A transceiver could be a type of an antenna switch. It could be a unit combining the functions of a transmitter and a receiver. It might be a component in a receiver that fills out unwanted interference. Or it could be a type of antenna matching network. I think this one's pretty easy, jumps right out at you. A transceiver is a combination of transmitter and receiver. It's like a modem. Modulator, demodulator, transceiver. So B is the right answer here. An antenna switch is just a switch. A component or repeater that fills out unwanted interference is, they call them cans or different types of filters. And an antenna matching network is, again, a whole different thing. So transceiver is a transmitter and receiver in one. Most of the radios you it's is a transceiver. It's it lets you hear as well as talk at the same time. Didn't always used to be that way, and if you get into the really old school kind of radio stuff, so you're going back into the old Heathkit days, you actually had a big box that was your transmitter and a big box that was your receiver. Definitely not the case in the solid circuit kind of days now. So once you pass your test, let's say you went in, you came in, you sat down, you took your test, 35 minutes later, they say, congratulations, you passed your test. Here you go. What's going to happen? Well, the folks that test you are going to take that paperwork, and it'll work its way up to the FCC. The FCC says, all right, well, this group, the Alfred Memorial Radio Club group conducted this test, so we know it's okay. They say you passed, and they'll give you a call sign. Right now, all the call signs are issued sequentially, and we are in an area where call signs always include the number 4. So if you're in Metro Atlanta, or if you're in the South anywhere, you will get a call sign something like KO4, because KO is the next sequence that we're working on now, XYZ. When I first got licensed, I was KJ4FIK. So that was 12 years ago. We went from KJ to KO at the now. The next group will be KNs and or KPs, and we'll keep going on there. As soon as you get your license, and you don't even have to have a physical copy in your hand, you can just see it on the FCC website. Time to get on the air. You can start talking and have a good time. Now, I mentioned here a second ago that my call sign was N4BFR and not KJ4FIK, which is what I was given. I went ahead and got a custom call sign. It's a vanity license, if you will. So the things that I had to do for this, though, is I had to choose between a 1 to 2 character prefix. It could be KO, KN, NK, W, some combinations of A, but always with another letter before the number. It will be a number 0 through 9. Like I said, 4 is the Southeast, but I wasn't required to do that. I know a ham who lived in the Southeast who had a call sign with 0 in it. So call signs are generally assigned by a regional area to start. Most hams choose to kind of keep that regional number with them, but it's not required. So if I wanted to be, K6JIM and that call sign was available, I could be, but it does start off assigning call signs regionally. If I took my test and lived in California, I would by default get a 6 call sign. So that's just how they've assigned them at the moment. And there's more in that as you study and take the test. And then they'll end up with a 2 to 3 character suffix. So my call sign could be as short as N4BF, but most of the shorter call signs are already taken, so N4BFR is where I ended. I won't get into all the exceptions and those kind of things, but Altec, I think I hit your question on the 4 in the call sign. It's basically on the region where you started in general. All right, so you've got your license. You can customize your call sign. By the way, customizing your call sign is free. Used to be $10 or $15 to apply. Now you see a call sign you like, you can apply. I told my wife I've had the N4BFR call sign for about 11 years now, and I told my wife the other day that I was thinking about looking at another one because I know that I think it's W4JR is coming up, and as Jim Reed, that would be a nice call sign to have. She's like, what the heck will you do with everything that has N4BFR on it? Which I couldn't give her a good answer to. So maybe I won't change my call sign, but we'll see. All right, so we know you can't test right now because you got to test in person, so all the testing is stopped because of all the shelter-in-place rules. But you want to do something, and you've got an Amazon account and a credit card, so what are some of these things you could do to get busy now? Well, I'll tell you about 3 things you can kind of do to listen before you get started. And that's always good advice for ham radio as well. Even before you start talking, the advice is kind of listen, and see how that works. First thing you can do is do a radio scanner. I've got one here, looks like this. You've probably seen them all before. These are the kind of things that take that people take to the NASCAR races, or they go to the airport to listen to the planes on. This is the kind of thing that will pick up analog transmissions. If you go with the very basic ones, this one's a super fancy one. It picks up some digital transmissions as well. But this is just kind of listen, and pick up on some of those local frequencies that you're working on. You want to go more distant. You want to, the HF really interests you. You want to listen to shortwave radio. You can pick one of those up. I've found them. I think I found one at Fry's for $35 a while back. Here's the one I actually started with. This is the one that got me listening to things like rugby matches out of Australia at 2 in the morning to go, all right, maybe I like this ham thing. Maybe I like this talking distance thing. The other thing that's really fun to listen to, I like to, is to try and find either, they call them number stations, so there's, again, another whole shortwave listener genre, but number stations are stations that just kind of randomly pop up and start spewing out a bunch of numbers. They're supposedly related to old spy stations. Most people think they're more related to drugs right now, but you can listen to that. And the U.S. government does operate a number station as well. So if you wanted to hear that, you could tune into 11,175 kilohertz to listen to the Air Force Global number station. So you can listen to the U.S. number station if you want. You can listen to long distance planes on here is another thing, right? So if you want to hear the traffic from planes flying over the Atlantic between Gatwick and New York, there are stations for that as well, because that's how they communicate. So shortwave gets you those kind of communications to listen to. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about is the RTL SDR dongle. This is something that, especially in the last 5 or 6 years, a lot of folks have gotten into. Here's one of mine. And this is listening to not only digital communications, but you can listen to analog communications as well. This little sucker will pick up basically where the shortwave radio leaves off and take you all the way up into some of the satellite frequencies. So it's about 28 to 1.5 gigahertz. You can listen to airplane beacons. You can read the texts that airplanes send each other. You can see a lot of the things you don't see on frequencies. One of my favorite things to listen to on either a scanner or my smart SDR dongle is I tune into the frequency 450.250 megahertz, so 450.250 megahertz. And that locally here in Atlanta is WSB traffic back channel, so you can hear Mark Aram and Doug Turnbull and all those folks talk to each other and coordinate the communications in their reports before they go. So you do pick up traffic tips sometimes 1 or 2 minutes earlier than you would hear them on the radio. So 450, 250 is a fun thing to listen to on a scanner or a dongle. All right. Decatur Makers is a great place to work on your ham radio because there's an amateur radio station there, and some folks here have helped with that. We started that off a couple of years ago with a radio and an airplane receiver. That airplane receiver is still there, so if you happen to be familiar with Decatur Makers, you walk in through the door, it's right there on the left, and it tracks all those airplane beacons using a thing just like this. We've recently put in a 2-meter radio that's a little mobile for talking on the different repeaters around. We put up a little antenna up in the eaves, but that could probably be improved. There's an HF radio there too. We used to have an HF antenna outside, got blown down. We need to replace that as well. So we're looking for antennas. We're looking for operators. If you're looking for a way to get into radio that really doesn't cost anything, you don't have to go buy equipment. If you were part of Decatur Makers, you'd have this equipment available to use and can help us kind of get that antenna up and do some of the other things as well. So if you're interested in that, I definitely encourage you to kind of ping me after or send me a message at some point, and we can hook up more. There's also a Slack channel on Decatur Makers for ham radio as well, so that has some opportunities for people as well. All right. Went through all of that, and I filled a lot of people's heads with a lot of different information. But I think the thing that I wanted to leave you with is, what do you do next? I'm interested. This sounds like fun. I want to get going. What can I do to get started? First thing I would suggest is there's all kinds of different websites. You can, I know you know how to Google. Just say, hey, practice ham radio exam. Hamexam.org is one of them. QRZ.com is one of them. I used something called Ham Test Online, which I think is free for technicians. And you go in, and the thing I liked about Ham Test Online is it would tell you, okay, well, you're great at the section related to the phonetic alphabet, but you need to spend more time on the questions related to RF safety or whatever it might be. So it will help judge you and guide you that way if you want to check that out. Another thing you can do is while you can't take the test right now, you can certainly get watching or reading. There's stuff on my YouTube channel, not to promote that because it's not really training material, but there are training videos up there. If you're interested in Morse code, I just saw the other day there's a Morse code class getting ready to start up on YouTube in a couple of weeks. You can buy a book. ARRL publishes books. There's a guy by the name of Gordon West who publishes books. If you like Gordon West stuff, there is a podcast called Ham Nation that Gordon's on. A bunch of other people are on as well. Once a week, talks about ham radio. There's an ARRL site. Another podcast you might want to listen to that I particularly enjoy is 100 Watts and a Wire. So a couple of things you can check out there. Local clubs. So in addition to getting active with Decatur Makers and the ham radio group there, the two kind of most geographically located clubs to Decatur Makers are the Atlanta Radio Club, which is based out of downtown Atlanta, and the Alfred Memorial Radio Club, which is based out of Stone Mountain. Both are holding virtual meetings right now as a way to just kind of keep the things going. And in fact, Alfred Memorial Radio Club meeting is this Thursday. I think their website is topoftherock.org or totronline.org. Alfred Memorial Radio Club in Google will get you there. And they have virtual meeting Thursday night, so you can kind of check out some of the things they're talking about. And all of this is about having fun. So the folks in the club are glad to mentor new people. They're glad to help you work through it because sometimes it's something that they wanted to be interested in that they haven't been able to do. Sometimes it's just something that you're a little bit more of an expert in than somebody else is, or you can very easily trade information and kind of trade help on different things. I've got a friend who's really good at Morse code, but I'm kind of a little bit better at setting up some of the technology stuff. So he helps me with my code, I help him with his tech stuff, and we all kind of have this nice relationship. So have fun, make new friends, talk to people. It's all out there in the ham radio world. So I've gone about an hour, which is longer than I expected to. As far as going through the slides, which is good, but I've got plenty of time. So if there are folks that have other questions, now's a great time to use the chat functionality. Throw your questions up there, and I will try and do my best not to be stumped. I used to work at a place where I would go around to the sales reps, and I would try and make them ask me a question about our products and stump me to see if they could do it, and I had a pretty good track record. Now, as I said before, there are some areas of ham radio that I haven't totally dug into, but hopefully you won't stump me. So we'll give it a second to see if there are any other questions or comments. Throw them in the YouTube chat window, and I'm glad to answer them. While we're thinking about that, a couple other, let me give a plug to a couple other clubs that are in the area. So we're really lucky to have one of the more active amateur radio communities here. There's a store out on Buford Highway called Ham Radio Outlet. If you want to get a book, if you want to buy your first radio, that's a great place to go. They don't have a... they have a drive-up service right now because social distancing, but they can get you the manuals or that kind of thing as well. And then there's also some other clubs in the area too. If you're up in North Fulton County, there's the North Fulton Amateur Radio League. There's Gwinnett Amateur Radio Society in Gwinnett County, and it's interesting to watch. Those two groups are both about 250, 300 members, and it's fun to watch them kind of, well, I can do field day better than you. Well, I can do this thing better than you. So it's a little intramural rivalry that's great. But all the clubs come together for events too, like local ham fest. There's going to be a ham fest here, hopefully in June, if things clear up. If not, for sure by November. And you can go out and buy other people's old stuff or buy new stuff and meet your friends and learn some things as well. So they always have classes and testing too. All those are out there. Question from the chat room: how much can I expect to spend to enter the hobby as a technician? You can spend really as little or as much as you want. I'm going to say you're probably going to spend no more than $15 on the test. Now, if you want to start transmitting, you're going to need some kind of transmitter. If your interest is more on the high frequency, the HF side, and the long distance international communications, you may spend $400 or $500 on a good used radio like Yaesu FT450D, an older ICOM radio. Those things work great. They never go out of style, but as folks are upgrading to the latest and greatest, they're picking up new things and selling off their old one. If you're going to get into the public service communication side of it, then I'd say you're probably going to buy a couple of radios. You're going to buy some sort of handheld. This one's in the $500 or $600 range, but you can, there are handhelds down to $35, and you get a little bit of what you pay for as far as ease of programming and those kind of things. But if you wanted to start and talk through the repeaters and spend $35, you can definitely get on for as little as $35. But you probably want one of these handhelds for walking around, and maybe one in your car as well. So $300, $400, $500, but you can really do it at your own pace, and it doesn't cost a lot to start talking. And again, if you're a member of Decatur Makers, they've got the radios there, so there's really no charge to getting in to start using a radio. I also say a great way to do things is to ask a friend or find, we call them Elmer in the ham radio group's hobbies. They are people who will be able to help you out, let you try using their equipment. Go to an event like a thing called Field Day or some kind of event that ham radio folks are having. You will definitely find somebody who will let you try and use their radio as well. All right, it looks like we used up all the questions, and I don't want to run too much further over. I wanted to kind of keep this to an hour. So I am going to go ahead and wrap this up, but let me do a couple of things. First, I want to thank Decatur Makers for helping kind of get the word out on this and joining them. I know as a member there, it's tough with the building closed to be able to kind of do makery kind of things at home for some people. And it's also a time when some people want to learn some new things. So Decatur Makers is a great place to do that, and thank them for taking a chance on me and letting me do this presentation in association with them. Also want to thank thank my friends at the Atlanta Radio Club and at the Alfred Memorial Radio Club for kind of giving me advice and looking through my stuff as well. If you want more information, I have a blog, and it should hopefully be real easy to remember, n4bfr.com. I will put the slide deck up there so you can go back through it at your will. I'll also put a link to the video up there. We recorded it as we went along, so we will have a place to go back if you want to check things as well. And I'm at N4BFR on Twitter. Ask me questions. I'm more than happy to. If I don't know the answer, I probably know who to point you at to get you going as well, either through Decatur Makers or one of the local clubs. So appreciate that. Hope everybody had a great day. Stay safe, stay inside.